Before there was Hulk Hogan, before there was Ric Flair, before any of them figured out how to turn a personality into a phenomenon, there was one man, one wrestler, one bleached blonde, robe-wearing, perfume-spraying showman from the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, who figured it all out first. His name was George Raymond Wagner, but the world knew him as Gorgeous George. And he didn't just change professional wrestling, he changed everything. Television, entertainment, the very concept of what it meant to be a celebrity in America. He was the original, the prototype, the man who proved that if you could make people feel something, anything, even if that something was pure hatred, you could become the most famous person on the planet. And the story of how a scrawny, dirt-poor kid from the Great Depression grew up to become the highest-paid athlete in the world, only to lose it all and die broke and alone at the age of 48, is one of the most incredible and tragic stories in the history of professional wrestling, in the history of American entertainment, maybe in the history of fame itself. This is the story of Gorgeous George, the man who invented the modern wrestling villain. And by the time we reach the end of this story, you will understand why a man who has been dead for over 60 years still casts a shadow over everything you watch today. Let us start at the beginning, and the beginning was bleak. George Raymond Wagner was born on March 24, 1915 in Butte, Nebraska, a tiny speck of a town in the middle of the American heartland. His family was of German heritage, working-class people who scraped by however they could. For a time, they lived on a farm near a village called Phoenix in Holt County. Then they moved to Waterloo, Iowa, then to Sioux City, then eventually down to Houston, Texas, where George would spend the formative years of his childhood. None of these moves were by choice. The Wagners moved because they had to, because the money ran out, because the work dried up, because that was life in America during the Great Depression. George was not a big kid. He was not an imposing physical specimen, but he was tough, he was resourceful, and he had something burning inside of him that the poverty and the constant moving could not extinguish. A need to be something, a need to be seen, a need to matter. He dropped out of school at age 14. That was not unusual for boys of his generation. Your family needed you to work, and survival came before education. And so young George Wagner found himself doing odd jobs, whatever he could find, trying to help keep his family afloat. But he also found something else. At the local YMCA in Houston, George discovered wrestling, not the theatrical kind. Not yet, the real kind. Amateur wrestling, grappling, the fundamental art of taking another man to the ground and controlling him. And George took to it immediately. He was small, but he was quick. He was wiry. He had a natural understanding of leverage and positioning that bigger, stronger kids simply did not possess. By the time he was in his mid-teens, George had started hanging around the carnival wrestling circuit. This was the 1930s, and professional wrestling in America was still a roughneck business. Carnivals would travel from town to town, setting up tents and challenging local toughs to step into the ring. If you could last a certain amount of time, you won a prize. If you couldn't, you went home with bruises and a story. George started wrestling professionally around 1932. He was 17 years old, just a kid with no money, no connections, no family name to trade on. Just a willingness to get into a ring and fight. And for the next decade, that is exactly what he did. George Wagner wrestled under his real name everywhere. Small towns, big cities, smoke-filled arenas, outdoor shows. Anywhere someone would book him, he showed up. He worked hard and was technically sound, but there was a problem. A fundamental problem. Nobody cared. George Wagner at 5'9" and barely 200 pounds was just another wrestler. In an era dominated by men who stood 6 feet tall and weighed well over 250 pounds, George was forgettable. Promoters looked at him and saw a reliable worker. A guy who could fill out an undercard. But not a star. He did not have the size or the look. For roughly 10 years, George Wagner existed in this professional purgatory. Making a living, yes. Wrestling was better than factory work or farm labor, but going nowhere, spinning his wheels. Watching other men with half his talent but twice his size get the opportunities he desperately wanted. And then something changed. Something that would alter the trajectory of not just one man's career, but the entire entertainment landscape of the 20th century. The change started with a woman, his wife Betty. George had married Betty Hansen in 1939. The wedding itself was a piece of show business. They got married in a wrestling ring in Eugene, Oregon, because George understood even then that spectacle drew attention. The wedding was so popular with wrestling fans that George and Betty reenacted it in similar venues all over the country. That instinct for showmanship, that understanding that people wanted to be entertained, not just shown a wrestling match, was always there inside George Wagner. He just hadn't figured out how to fully unleash it yet. Betty helped him figure it out. The story goes that George and Betty were brainstorming one day. They were trying to come up with something, anything, that would make George stand out from the dozens of other mid-level wrestlers grinding away on the circuit. George had been following the career of a wrestler named Wilbur Finran, who performed under the name Lord Patrick Lansdowne. Lansdowne was a smaller guy too, and he had found success by adopting a snobbish, aristocratic persona. He wore velvet robes. He had valets accompany him to the ring. He cheated shamelessly and acted like he was better than everyone else. And the fans hated him for it, hated him enough to buy tickets. George looked at what Lansdowne was doing and had a revelation. If a little bit of showmanship could draw a reaction like that, what would happen if you turned it up to 11? What would happen if you became the most outrageous, the most infuriating, the most unforgettable character anyone had ever seen? Betty's mother, Elsie Hansen, was a talented seamstress. She began making elaborate robes for George, not the kind of simple robes that other wrestlers occasionally wore. These were productions: satin, silk, sequins, lace, fur trim, the kind of garments that a man in the 1940s would never, under any circumstances, be caught dead wearing. George began building a collection of over 100 of these robes, each more extravagant than the last. Then came the hair. George grew it out long. He curled it, and then he did something that, in 1940s America, was absolutely unthinkable for a man. He bleached it platinum blonde. He secured those flowing golden locks with gold-plated bobby pins. He called them Georgie pins. He would later toss them to the crowd as souvenirs, and fans would scramble to catch them like they were made of real gold. And then came the name. According to multiple accounts, George was at a wrestling show in Oregon in the early 1940s, fussing over his new robe, adjusting his hair, preening for the crowd. A woman in the audience looked at him and said it. Oh, isn't he gorgeous? Some versions of the story claim that woman was actually Betty herself, planting the seed. Either way, the name stuck. George Wagner was dead. Gorgeous George was born. But the character was more than just a new name and a new look. It was a complete reinvention of what a professional wrestler could be. It was a philosophy, an approach, a worldview. See, up until Gorgeous George, professional wrestling villains were ugly. They were dirty. They were brutish thugs. The bad guys looked like bad guys, and the good guys looked like good guys, and the audience understood immediately who to cheer and who to boo based on nothing more than appearance. Gorgeous George flipped that entire concept on its head. He was beautiful, he was elegant, he was refined. He was everything the audience was not. And that was exactly why they despised him with a passion that the wrestling business had never seen before. He dubbed himself the Human Orchid. He demanded that the ring announcer introduce him with grandiose proclamations. He insisted that the audience stand in a show of respect before he would even enter the arena. And when he finally did make his entrance, it was unlike anything anyone in professional wrestling had ever witnessed. The music would start. Pomp and Circumstance by Edward Elgar. That regal, stately, unmistakable melody that decades later Randy Savage would make famous all over again. Gorgeous George was the first professional wrestler in history to use entrance music. Think about that. Every single wrestler who has ever walked to the ring with a theme song playing, from Hulk Hogan to The Undertaker to Stone Cold, Steve Austin, owes that innovation to Gorgeous George. Then the spotlight would hit, a purple spotlight following George as he made his way to the ring. He walked slowly, deliberately, like royalty processing through a crowd of commoners. He was escorted by his valet, a man named Jeffries, dressed in a tuxedo, who carried a silver mirror and walked ahead spreading rose petals at George's feet. A red carpet was laid out because the arena floor was far too filthy for his feet. Once they reached the ring, the performance was only beginning. Jeffries would spray the ring with a spray gun filled with perfume, not just any perfume. Gorgeous George claimed it was Chanel No. 10. When asked why not Chanel No. 5, he would respond with his signature line, "Why be half safe?" The ropes were sprayed, the turnbuckles were sprayed, then the referee would approach to perform the standard pre-match check for illegal objects. But before the referee was allowed to touch Gorgeous George, Jeffries would spray the referee's hands with disinfectant, because George could not possibly allow those filthy, common hands to touch his magnificent body without proper sanitization. And then, when the referee finally did begin the pat-down, George would recoil in theatrical horror and scream, "Get your filthy hands off me!" The crowd would lose its mind. They would scream, they would throw things, they would boo until their voices were raw, and the match had not even started yet. This is the part that people sometimes miss when they talk about Gorgeous George. Yes, the entrance was genius. Yes, the character was revolutionary. But George was also a legitimately skilled wrestler. He had been doing this for a decade before he became Gorgeous George. He knew how to work a match. He knew how to tell a story in the ring. And the story he told was brilliant in its simplicity. Once the bell rang, Gorgeous George would cheat. Constantly, shamelessly. He would gouge eyes, he would pull hair, he would use the ropes for leverage. He would distract the referee while Jeffries interfered from the outside. He was the industry's first true cowardly villain. A man who talked endlessly about how gorgeous and superior he was, but who could not win a fair fight to save his life. And the audience ate it up, not because they enjoyed watching him win. They came because they wanted to see him lose. They wanted to see this preening, perfumed, platinum-haired peacock get his teeth kicked in. They wanted to see the good guy wipe the smirk off his face. They wanted justice. And here is the genius of it. Whether George won or lost, the audience got their money's worth. If he won by cheating, they were furious and came back next week hoping to see him get what was coming to him. If he lost, they were ecstatic and came back to see it happen again. It was a perpetual motion machine of audience engagement that guaranteed packed houses no matter the outcome. By the mid-1940s, Gorgeous George was becoming a star. But what happened next elevated him from regional wrestling attraction to genuine national phenomenon. Television happened. In the late 1940s, television was brand new. Most Americans had never seen one. The sets were expensive. The screens were tiny. The picture was grainy, black and white, and the networks were desperate for content that would convince people to buy one of these strange new devices. Professional wrestling turned out to be the perfect fit. It was exciting, dramatic, easy to follow. The cameras could capture the action without elaborate setups, and the characters were larger than life. But even among wrestlers, Gorgeous George was different. On those small, grainy, black and white television screens, most wrestlers looked the same. Two guys in plain trunks grappling with each other, hard to tell apart, hard to get invested in. Gorgeous George, though, you could not miss him. The platinum hair practically glowed on screen. The elaborate robes were impossible to ignore. The theatrical entrances were captivating in a way that nothing else on early television was. He popped off the screen. He demanded your attention even through 6 inches of flickering cathode ray tube. The effect on television sales was staggering. Appliance stores began advertising that they carried television sets so customers could watch Gorgeous George wrestle. Bars and restaurants installed televisions specifically so patrons could see his matches. People gathered in front of store windows to watch him on the display models. Families pooled their money to buy their first television set, and the thing that finally tipped them over the edge was wanting to watch Gorgeous George at home. Entertainment Weekly would later name his 1947 television debut as one of the top 100 televised moments of the entire 20th century. That is not a wrestling accolade. That is a television accolade, a cultural accolade. Because Gorgeous George was not just a wrestling star who happened to be on TV. He was a television star who happened to be a wrestler. There is a crucial difference. By the end of the 1940s, Gorgeous George was arguably the most famous person in America. Not the most famous wrestler, the most famous person. Every comedian in the country had a Gorgeous George joke. Jack Benny referenced him. Bob Hope referenced him. He appeared on talk shows, in magazines, in newspapers. He crossed over from the wrestling page to the front page. And the money followed the fame. At his absolute peak, Gorgeous George was earning over $100,000 a year. That was roughly what Joe DiMaggio was earning with the New York Yankees, a professional wrestler matching the Yankee Clippers' salary. That had never happened before. George often demanded and received a percentage of the gate receipts from his matches. He knew what he was worth. He knew that when his name was on the marquee, the building sold out, and he made sure the promoters paid him accordingly. By any reasonable measure, Gorgeous George was the highest-paid athlete in the world during his peak years. He bought a turkey ranch in Beaumont, California. He opened a cocktail lounge in Van Nuys called Gorgeous George's Ringside Restaurant. He lived lavishly. He spent lavishly. He was, for a few glorious years, living proof that a kid from nowhere with nothing could become everything. And then there were the championships. Because while Gorgeous George transcended titles, while he was one of those rare performers who did not need a belt around his waist to be the biggest draw in the business, he held gold. In 1950, he defeated Don Eagle to win the AWA World Heavyweight Championship. That was the Boston version of the AWA, not the Minneapolis promotion that Laverne Clarence would later run. He held that title for about 6 months. He also captured the Los Angeles version of the World Championship, the Gulf Coast title, and the Southern Heavyweight Championship. Over the course of his career, he was credited with having over 3,000 professional wrestling matches. But the titles were almost beside the point. Like Roddy Piper decades later, Gorgeous George understood that the heat, the reaction, the ability to make people pay money to see you was more valuable than any championship. The belt was a prop. The character was the product, and nobody had ever been a better product than Gorgeous George. His most famous matches were not championship bouts at all. They were hair matches, stipulation matches where George's beloved golden locks were on the line. If he lost, his head would be shaved bald in front of the entire audience. And those matches drew monster crowds. On March 12, 1959, Gorgeous George faced Whipper Billy Watson at Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto. Over 20,000 fans packed the building. They did not come to see a title change hands. They came to see Gorgeous George lose his hair. And when Watson won, when the clippers came out, when those platinum curls fell to the mat, the roar of the crowd was deafening. It was one of the most memorable moments in the history of professional wrestling up to that point. Years later, in what turned out to be his very last match, George would lose his hair again. On November 7, 1962, at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, Gorgeous George faced the Destroyer in a hair versus mask match. George lost. His head was shaved one final time, and the career of the most influential performer in the history of professional wrestling came to an end. Not with a bang, not with a retirement ceremony, just a bald head and the slow, terrible understanding that it was over. But before we get to the ending, we need to talk about the influence. The influence of Gorgeous George is so vast, so far-reaching, so deeply embedded in the DNA of modern entertainment that you cannot fully appreciate what he did without understanding who he inspired. Start with wrestling itself. Every single heel who came after Gorgeous George borrowed something from him. Nature Boy Buddy Rogers took his arrogance and strutting. Superstar Billy Graham took the physique-obsessed showmanship. Ric Flair took the robes, the strutting, the limousine-riding lifestyle gimmick, and built a Hall of Fame career out of it. Freddie Blassie, Adrian Adonis, Goldust, all of them descendants of Gorgeous George. Every wrestler who has ever used entrance music, worn an elaborate robe, employed a valet, or turned their entrance into a spectacle owes a direct debt to George Wagner. But the influence goes far beyond wrestling. Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, the greatest, whatever you want to call him. The most famous boxer who ever lived has openly, repeatedly, enthusiastically credited Gorgeous George as the primary inspiration for his persona. The story is well documented. In June of 1961, a 19-year-old Cassius Clay was in Las Vegas doing a radio interview to promote his 7th fight. And on that same radio show was Gorgeous George. Clay watched as this wrestler worked the radio audience into a frenzy. George was shouting about how gorgeous he was, how no one could beat him, how if some bum managed to defeat him, he would crawl across the ring and cut off his own hair. But it was never going to happen because he was the greatest wrestler in the world. And young Cassius Clay sat there, mesmerized. He saw the crowd at George's wrestling match that night, sold out, every seat taken. People who had paid their hard-earned money just to see this man get beat. And Clay understood something that would change his career forever. It did not matter whether people loved you or hated you. What mattered was that they cared. What mattered was that they paid. Ali himself told biographer Thomas Hauser that George had said to him that night that most of the crowd hated him, and the rest wanted to kiss him. But the important thing was that they had all paid their money and the place was full. Ali had good looks, a great body, and a big mouth. People would pay to see somebody shut it. So keep on bragging, keep on sassing, and always be outrageous. Ali took that advice and transformed himself. He started predicting what round he would knock out his opponents, reciting poems about his own greatness, taunting the men he was about to fight. He became the most compelling, most controversial, most talked about athlete on the planet. Ali later told reporters that he probably owed Gorgeous George a lot of money, that without George, nobody would have heard of Cassius Clay. Then there was James Brown, the godfather of soul, the hardest working man in show business. In his autobiography, Brown wrote explicitly about the influence of Gorgeous George on his stage persona. He said the capes he wore came from the wrestler Gorgeous George, that seeing him on TV helped to create the James Brown you see on stage. The sequined capes, the theatrical presentation, the sense that every performance was a spectacle, not just a concert. All of it traced back to a platinum-haired wrestler who understood that showmanship was everything. And Bob Dylan. In his memoir Chronicles Volume 1, Dylan described an encounter with Gorgeous George in Hibbing, Minnesota. Dylan was a young Bobby Zimmerman at the time, performing on a makeshift stage when George roared into town for a wrestling match. Dylan described George as a mighty spirit and said that crossing paths with Gorgeous George was all the recognition and encouragement he would need for years to come. Think about that. Muhammad Ali, James Brown, Bob Dylan, 3 of the most important cultural figures of the 20th century. And all 3 pointed back to the same source. A professional wrestler from Nebraska who figured out that personality was more powerful than talent and that spectacle was more valuable than substance. There was Liberace too, who reportedly modeled aspects of his stage persona after Gorgeous George. George noticed and grumbled about it to a reporter in 1955. "He is imitating me," George said. John Waters, the filmmaker, spoke about seeing Gorgeous George as a child and being captivated by a man who wore women's clothes, who had bleached hair, who made people scared but also made them laugh. Even a Bugs Bunny cartoon from 1951 featured a character directly inspired by Gorgeous George. The man had permeated every level of American culture. And here is where the story turns. Because this is where the triumph becomes tragedy, and the tragedy of Gorgeous George is as instructive as the triumph, maybe more so. The wrestling bubble on television began to deflate in the mid-1950s. There was simply too much of it. Wrestling had been airing on prime time every single night of the week, and even the most devoted fans eventually grew weary. The networks began pulling wrestling from their schedules, the live crowds thinned out, the money that had seemed inexhaustible started to dry up. George was getting older, he was in his 40s now. His body had absorbed decades of punishment. 3,000 matches over 30 years takes a toll that no amount of showmanship can hide. Younger, bigger, more athletic wrestlers were coming up and taking the spotlight, and George was spending money faster than he was making it. The turkey ranch, the restaurant, the lavish lifestyle, 2 marriages, 2 expensive divorces. Bad investments ate away at whatever savings he had managed to accumulate. By the late 1950s, the man who had once been the highest-paid athlete in the world was wrestling for small promotions just to pay the bills. And then there was the drinking. George had always been a drinker. Many wrestlers of that era were. The road was long and lonely, and alcohol was the most readily available coping mechanism. But for George, the drinking had always served another purpose as well. He was, by many accounts, actually a somewhat shy and reserved person beneath the Gorgeous George persona. The outrageous confidence, the theatrical bombast, the willingness to stand in front of thousands of hostile strangers and antagonize them, that did not come naturally. George used alcohol to become Gorgeous George, liquid courage to fuel the performance. And over the years, the drinking that had started as a tool became a prison. The alcohol that had given him the nerve to be outrageous slowly, methodically destroyed his body. His liver began to fail. The diagnosis was grim. Cirrhosis, the kind of damage that does not heal, the kind of damage that only gets worse. His second marriage, to a woman named Cherie Dupre, ended in 1962. That same year, he wrestled his final match against the Destroyer at the Olympic Auditorium. He lost. His head was shaved, and Gorgeous George walked out of a wrestling arena for the last time. The final months were devastating. The man who had once been the most famous person in America was now broke, sick, and largely forgotten. He had to sell the turkey ranch that had been his retirement investment. The restaurant was gone. The money was gone. The wives were gone. The fame, that enormous world-consuming fame that had once seemed as permanent as the sun, had evaporated like morning dew. On Christmas Eve, 1963, George Raymond Wagner suffered a massive heart attack. He was 48 years old. He died 2 days later, on December 26, 1963, in Los Angeles, California. He died nearly penniless, the man who had earned more money than Joe DiMaggio, the man who had sold out every arena in America, the man who had helped sell millions of television sets, did not have enough money to pay for his own funeral. But someone stepped forward, a wrestler named Angelo Poffo. Poffo had been a young wrestler who had crossed paths with Gorgeous George during his career. George had inspired him, motivated him, shown him what was possible in the wrestling business. And when George died broke, Poffo paid for the funeral. He made sure that the man who had created the modern wrestling villain received a proper burial. George was laid to rest in one of his glamorous ring robes. Even in death, he was Gorgeous George. And here is the beautiful coda to that particular piece of the story. Angelo Poffo had a son. That son grew up watching his father wrestle, grew up hearing the stories about the flamboyant performer who had changed everything. That son would grow up to become one of the most iconic wrestlers of the 1980s. His name was Randy Poffo, but you know him as the Macho Man Randy Savage. And what music did Macho Man Randy Savage choose as his entrance theme? What song would become synonymous with one of the most electrifying performers in the history of professional wrestling? Pomp and Circumstance, the same song that Gorgeous George had chosen decades earlier, the same melody that had once heralded the arrival of the human orchid. Randy Savage chose that music as a tribute to the man who had inspired his father. A full circle moment that connected the golden age of wrestling to the rock and roll era and proved that Gorgeous George's influence would never truly die. The wrestling world eventually recognized what George Wagner had meant to the business. He was inducted into the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2002 and the WWE Hall of Fame in 2010. The award was accepted by his first wife, Betty, who was 97 years old at the time. The woman who had helped create the character. The woman who had been there when a voice from the crowd said, "Oh, isn't he gorgeous?" and a legend was born. The story of Gorgeous George is ultimately a story about the power of reinvention. George Wagner was too small, too plain, too ordinary. He was told in 1,000 different ways that he would never be a star. And instead of accepting that verdict, he burned George Wagner to the ground and built something entirely new from the ashes. Something that no one had ever seen before. Something that the world did not know it needed until it saw it. Every professional wrestler who has ever crafted a character, every boxer who has ever talked trash at a press conference, every musician who has ever understood that the show starts the moment you step into the spotlight, all of them are walking in the footsteps of Gorgeous George. He invented the entrance. He invented the gimmick. He invented the heel persona as we know it. He was one of the first superstars of television. He was the bridge between the old world of entertainment, where performers were humble and restrained and grateful, and the new world, where they were outrageous and unapologetic and larger than life. But the story is also a cautionary tale, because the same qualities that made Gorgeous George a star also destroyed him. He could not save his money because saving money was ordinary. He could not stop drinking because sobriety was ordinary. He could not slow down because slowing down was ordinary. And Gorgeous George would never be ordinary. He died at 48. He died broke. He died largely forgotten by the mainstream culture that had once worshipped him. And it would take decades for the world to fully appreciate what he had started. What he had set in motion with a bleached blonde wig and a bottle of perfume, and the audacity to tell the world that he was the most gorgeous thing it had ever seen. There was sports entertainment before Gorgeous George arrived, and sports entertainment after. The industry was never the same. John Capuya wrote the definitive biography in 2008. He titled it Gorgeous George, the outrageous bad boy wrestler who created American pop culture. While that might sound like hyperbole, the evidence suggests it is not far from the truth. He proved that you did not have to be the strongest or the most talented. You just had to be unforgettable. George Raymond Wagner, born March 24, 1915 in Butte, Nebraska, died December 26, 1963 in Los Angeles, California. Professional wrestler, television pioneer, cultural revolutionary, the original Gorgeous George. They do not make them like that anymore. But then again, they never did. There was only ever one. And the world has been living in his shadow ever since. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.